Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's session. My name is Elizabeth Manuel, and I'm the Senior Director of Student Services for the Higher Education Policy Commission and the Community and Technical College System. Before we get started, please feel free to jot down any questions you may have throughout the presentation in the session chat box just to the right of the screen. At the end of the speaker's presentation, we will address any questions that come in. With that, I do have the distinct pleasure of introducing this afternoon's session titled First Generation Student Success, Findings from a National Landscape Analysis. And our speaker for this session is a lifelong work has included issues of inequality, academic motivation, and decision-making, success of first generation and low income. Her scholarly research has examined the academic decision-making of low-income and first-generation college students in a post-recession context. Dr. Whitley is the author of First Generation Student Success, a landscape analysis of programs and services at four-year institutions. And a first-generation college graduate, Dr. Whitley holds a master's degree in college student personnel administration and a bachelor's degree in political science, and is a 2010 graduate of the Hers Institute. Here to discuss her take on First Generation Student Success, Assistant Vice President for the Center for First Generation Student Success, an initiative of NASPA, and the Suter Foundation. Please welcome Dr. Sarah Whitley.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. I'm really excited to be with you all this afternoon. I wish I was coming to you today from my my actual home, which is just across the border from West Virginia in Harrisonburg, Virginia. But I'm actually down in the Richmond area today, spending some time with my mom as she recovers from a hospitalization. And so excited to be with you all today and excited to talk with you all about what I consider to be my favorite topic is first generation college students. And so because you're here today, it means you have some sort of interest in first generation college students. And so for that, I'm grateful. I am personally a first generation college student. Our team at the center is predominantly composed of first generation college graduates. And so it's just a really nice opportunity to be with you all today and to talk about this important topic. So before I'm trying to go through a couple of screens here, before we go too far together in our time, I want us to stop for a moment and center power in place. And this is something that we do in a lot of our work in the center and at NASPA. And it's an opportunity for us to take a moment and think fully and ground ourselves in the places that we inhabit so that we can be fully present for our opportunity to learn today. As I mentioned, I'm with you all today from my hometown in Virginia, which are the native lands of the Powhatan and Appomattox people. And this is a place that still remains shaped by settler colonialism and indigenous erasure. And as we begin thinking about ways to rectify the undue harm and the trauma placed upon our indigenous communities, we must commit to doing the work of reflexive praxis to really take heed of the work and to understand our own privilege. And so what I've shared with you all today is a set of questions that we use and that we encourage those we engage with to begin thinking about as you do your own work in understanding indigenous and tribal nations and the land in which you inhabit. And so taking a moment to think about how do you benefit as a person from occupying these lands? How has your institutional organization benefited? And then how do you play a role in building and fostering a culture of examining place and presence? And so I always get started with that in our presentations and hope you will think a bit about that. If you would like to share anything about the indigenous communities where you reside in the chat, you're welcome to do so. And feel free to utilize the chat in any way that's beneficial to you during our time together today. So let's get into the business of our time together today. If this is the first time you're hearing about the center, I encourage you to come and get to know us a little bit. And the best way to do that is through visiting the center's website at firstgen.naspa.org. It is chock full of resources. The majority are free, open, available to you. Come learn. We just released a new set of national data fact sheets that are available for download. All of our reports are here. You can search program services. Thanks to the wonderful Jessica Colorado in the chat. Jessica is an assistant director in the center. She's going to keep you up to speed on things that are happening in our space via the chat. Something that you can also do is scroll down to the bottom of the website, put your email address in, and begin receiving our biweekly newsletter. That will get you access to a lot of resources that might be beneficial to you. Another way to get involved with the center and to get to know us a little bit is via social media. We're very active on social, so feel free to check us out at First Gen Center. And then if you're doing good work or want to talk First Gen, use the hashtag FirstGenForward. I would encourage you all to do that and let us know what you're up to, and then we can spend some time getting to know your programs and services and efforts and how we can elevate those as well. So I'm going to tell you, it's really hard to talk about all of this great content in 60 minutes. And so we're going to be moving pretty quick during our time together today, and I'm going to keep things at a pretty high level. However, the report, and I'm going to show you this in a moment, everything we're talking about today is available to you online, and it's free. Downloads the full report, executive summaries, fact sheets, everything you need to know. And so if you missed something or you want to learn more, that's a great place to start. And then you're also welcome to follow up with me at any time, and we can certainly have a continued conversation. So there are two reports we're going to be chatting about today, but because of our time constraints, I am going to be focusing more on the first report. This is the report about four-year institutions. In the next slide, I'm going to show you how to get access to all the community and technical colleges information. I am going to sprinkle in the community and technical colleges information throughout this presentation, but know that it's going to be a little bit four-year heavy, but we'll get to the community and technical colleges. If that area is something that you're interested in, I'm happy to have an offline conversation. I'm happy to have my colleague Melinda Karp engage in a conversation with you as well. She is the co-principal investigator on that study to get you up to speed. I will tell you, and she agrees with this, there is nothing in either report that isn't applicable in the alternate space. So what you see here in the four-year report is great for community and technical colleges. What's in the community and technical colleges report is great for four-year institutions. To be honest, the reason that we took two separate approaches to the work was because we felt community and technical colleges deserved their own report. We wanted to hear the real unique experiences of those students and those institutions, and wanted to dig in a different way to see what might come out a little bit different. And there is different information in both, but we definitely think it's applicable in both spaces. So this is the Community and Technical Colleges report. Jessica just linked both these reports in the chat as well. And so both of these are available for download. I'm going to tell you up front, they're hefty, they're big, they're 80, 90 pages. And so they're going to take you a little time to get through them, but they're chock full of good information that you all can engage with. So let's dig in a little bit here. It's wanting to move a little slowly on me to some context and methodology. And I'm going to start with focusing on removing this weird error message that keeps popping up. There we go. The methodology for the four-year report. And we used a similar methodology for both reports because we wanted to have comparative data. And so first we did a phased approach, a mixed methods approach that included interviews with faculty and administrators across institutions of higher education, about 45 institutions that we interviewed leaders at student success nonprofits. So this is a mix of professional associations. So if you think about the Council for Opportunity and Education, they were involved, but also organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who often fund a lot of work specific to first generation students. We also fully believe in the center that we can't do this work without the voices of students. So we also interviewed 40 first generation students across 8 institutions for the four-year report. We then partnered that with a national survey that included 371 leaders from 273 institutions. The content for community colleges is very similar. The numbers are very similar across how we took this approach, and then the numbers of participants are very similar as well within that report. You'll see it's a mix of public and private as well, and representation across student affairs, academic affairs, student success. One of the hardest things about doing first gen work is actually figuring out where the people are positioned at the institution. So because you might be in student affairs, academic affairs, multicultural, you might be in enrollment management, it's a bit of a mix. So in looking at four-year institutions, about 82% of those surveyed offer programs or services specific to first-generation college students. That number was relatively similar, it was a little bit lower. at community and technical colleges. Well, the difference that comes to light there is it doesn't mean the programs and services are specific to first-generation students. It may just mean that first-generation students cross the threshold of your door to access services that you may be offering for everyone. That's something that we heard quite a bit about from community and technical colleges, that they take a philosophy of everyone at community and technical colleges are first generation. And we know that that's not completely true, but there are large numbers of those students at those institutions. And so we have to kind of dig into the nuance here of what does it mean to actually support first generation students, or what does it mean to kind of have blanketed services that you hope first generation students access. So that's definitely a tricky nuance. And there's quite a bit of that. There's a whole chapter in the Community and Technical Colleges report about that particular topic. Something else I'm going to share with you today, and I'm not going to dig in too far just given our time, are these blue boxes. This is some of the really important qualitative data that came out of our reports. And I think it's something that's some of the most valuable information. You'll see here from our good friend, Dr. Leslie Pendleton at the Florida Mock-In Opportunity Scholars Program. She talks about the complexity of higher education and how we have to audit our internal processes. You're going to hear me talk a lot about auditing and the value of auditing. Auditing your processes, your procedures, your data, and your jargon is one of the easiest and best things you can do to start thinking about how you serve first-generation students. The reason I love auditing so much is because you can do it on your own. You don't need anyone's permission to do it. You can sit at your desk in your span of control and say, what am I doing to serve first generation students? How can I improve my practice, my policies? How's the way that I do business supportive of or a barrier to success for first generation students? Now, of course, what we want you to see go from there is, here's how my office does it, my department does it, my division does this, and grow and grow and grow. But really, it can start with just making that change individually, and everyone at the institution can start to do that kind of work. We do a lot of work in our First Scholars area of the center around auditing, and if that's something you want to dig in more to, feel free to reach out, and we're happy to support that. So let's talk a little bit about the first generation identity. What does it mean to be first generation? Who is first generation? And this was a really prominent component of the work that we've been doing. And really what we've been hearing is a need to dig into defining first gen with a desire to align, design, and measure. How do we understand who first generation students are? And I'll tell you, even a year ago, the experiences of first generation students look different than they do today. And so how are we kind of keeping up with the trends? Considering intersectionality, first generation is a deeply intersectional identity, and how are we considering that in our work? And then also, how do we begin shifting to an asset-based lens? I hope this isn't the first time you've heard the term asset-based, but if it is, it's something that I want you to take away with you today because it's critically important to the work of first generation students. So let's talk defining. We could spend the rest of the day together talking about the definition of first gen. It's a tricky one, and it might not seem like it, but it definitely is. So about 73% of institutions who participated have a formal definition of first generation. Now, I'll tell you the caveat there is that does not mean that the definition is used consistently across the institution. It just means that someone at the institution, the president, enrollment management, IR, someone said, here's our definition. It might be a committee. And what you'll see at the top here is about 56% of institutions identified neither parent or guardian earned a four-year college degree. This is a pretty close example to what we call the federal definition or the TRIO definition. Many institutions make a choice to use the TRIO definition because they believe they have to. And while you do need to do a really good job, don't hear me wrong on that, you got to do your reporting for TRIO to the T. You can also use other definitions and slice and dice that data in appropriate ways. You'll also see below it, neither parent earned a four-year degree from an institution in the United States. That's a really interesting caveat to this conversation. We are seeing more and more institutions shifting their definition of first gen to the second definition, neither parent earned or guardian earned a four-year college degree from an institution in the United States. This is particularly a popular conversation at four-year institutions. Only about 3% of community colleges reported being in the midst of these conversations. I think that number is going to grow, and I would tell you from the time we collected this data, this 15 15%, I would argue, has grown probably tremendously. We have already seen this change in a lot of schools in California, Texas, Florida, Chicago, New York. So larger urban centers are really thinking differently. But we're also seeing a student-led push to refining and thinking differently about your definition. And so if you are at an institution of higher ed and you don't know what your first gen definition is, I would encourage you to think about that. Go and ask some questions and then do some digging around on how the definition is being used at your institution, and is it being used with consistency. There are a number of institutions right now who are also scrapping their definition and starting fresh. We regularly get the question in the center of, well, what definition do you recommend? We recommend you identify the best definition for your institution. So if you serve large numbers of domestically born students with internationally educated parents, that second definition might be really important. If this is piquing your interest at all and you want to dig into this a little further, I would encourage you to check out the work of Dr. Robert Tukushian at the University of Georgia. His information is also on the center's website. He has a research team that studies the definition of first gen. They have a great couple of articles out that look at overlaying the definitions that you see here on the screen on a population of about 8,000 first generation students. And by changing the definition, it shifts the number of those students who could identify as first gen from 22 to 77%. So your definition matters, and it really helps you think about, too, what students might you be over-serving and what students might you be under-serving in your experience. And so, again, we could talk definition for the rest of the day. It's one of my favorite topics. But there's a lot here, and there's a lot in the reports about these particular topics as well. So I'd encourage you to dig in. So understanding what it means for students to be first gen. You'll see here there's quite a bit of content from some students who participated. They talked about things like having a moral responsibility to their families. They talked about being alone, that this was an experience that they kind of had to traverse without a lot of particular support. The student in particular lived in Florida, attended Cornell, had never set foot on campus, showed up with one suitcase 4,000 miles away from home, and the roommate showed up with a U-Haul full of materials and things, and they thought, holy moly, I have made a mistake, and really shared some interesting information. It's really important, I think, as for those of us, I was a campus-based practitioner for much of my career, having to do those check-ins. What is the current student experience? What are our students grappling with? And we sometimes hear that, I don't want to keep asking my students questions. I'm always asking them to be in focus groups. If they can see that change is going to happen, they want to participate. So talk with your students, get to know them. And in the very bottom here, we ask every student who participated a question about if they could go back to their institution the following summer during orientation and offer advice to first generation students who were just beginning their higher education experience, what would they tell them? And without fail, every student had a similar sentiment, which was, you deserve to be in college. You've worked hard. This was not a gift. They didn't just ask you to come here. They didn't take pity on you. You didn't get in on accident. You deserve to be in college, and that you deserve to be here and to stay through the experience. And while it's a really beautiful sentiment, there's also something really heavy about thinking that first gen students every single day have to remind themselves that they deserve to be in that space and doing that work, and how heavy that can be over time. So it's a really interesting conversations over that during the data collection experience. Sorry, my screen's moving around on me. So I'm going to just really quickly tell you throughout the presentation today and in the deck when we share this, you're going to see some highlights. I'm not going to dig into these too far with you today, but a question we often get is, what does first generation involvement of families look like across the country? You're going to see a couple of schools here who are doing really good work. I would encourage you to reach out, take a look. There's a number of institutions doing great family involvement. Virginia Commonwealth has a really interesting approach. UTSA, the University of Texas, San Antonio does great work, University of Rochester. So lots of good schools, and these institutions are all featured in the report. You can go and dig in. There's also a lot of family involvement content on the center's website, along with some online learning events around parent involvement. So you might want to dig into that a little bit if it's in your area of need. So let's talk about intersectionality. I mentioned earlier that the first-gen identity is deeply intersectional. We know, and we talk about it in the report as first-gen plus. So you might be first-gen plus a racial or ethnic minority, LGBTQ, low income. You also might be first-gen plus veteran student, full-time employed, part-time employed, parental caregiver, English language, cultural broker. There are a multitude of things, and there can be a lot of pluses in that too. You could be all of those things. We also know for some students, they've been grappling with their racial identity their entire life, but their first-gen identity is brand new to them. And they're thinking, oh, I didn't know this was a part of who I am. And so really the notion of intersectionality was prominent in our data collection. And it's really a driving factor in where programs and services reside within a campus community. And here's what I mean by that. And I'm going to refer to the first-gen plus identity as a secondary identity. I don't mean that it's less important, just for the clarity of conversation, first-gen and then plus the secondary identity. Most institutions were looking at the secondary identity to identify where they placed a service. So for instance, the majority of first-gen programs were initially placed in the Multicultural Center, the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Center, whatever the equivalent of that kind of language would be at your particular institution or organization. And so while that's a great place for them to be and where they should be, it's not the only place they should be within your institution, because we heard from students and also from practitioners that some students who were not connected with the programs and services in their DEI area, their multicultural center, didn't realize they could actually get the first-gen services without being affiliated with that office in a different way. So thinking differently, and we're going to talk about networking services, have it in those areas, but where else could it be within your institution? Similarly, some institutions place their services just in the financial aid office, and thinking about how do we create environments where everyone knows about first-gen resources rather than saying they can only be in one particular area. We also know that a lot of conversation is happening across the country around faculty and staff who are personally first-gen. If you're personally first-gen, thanks for being here and thanks for doing the work. And feel free, if you want to drop it in the chat, we're happy to celebrate you as well. But we know that that's really becoming a galvanizing force. First-gen faculty and staff want to become more engaged in advocating for first-gen students, but also learning how to teach and serve first-gen students in better ways. We'll talk about it here a little later, but if you're not familiar with National First Generation College Celebration Day every year on November 8th, or the whole month of November at a lot of institutions, we celebrate the first-gen identity, and we are seeing just an incredible uptick in faculty and staff engaging in that experience. Thanks, Carolyn, for sharing. Congrats on being first-gen, and would love to have you all engage in Celebration Day. Quick plug, until August 8th, our grant opportunity is open. So if you're looking for some dollars to support your Celebration Day events, you can apply through the center's website to receive a grant. And we would love to have some great schools in West Virginia get some dollars from us to grow your celebration events. And we can make sure you get some more information about that as well. So let's talk a little bit about shifting from a deficit to an asset-based lens. I mentioned earlier, I really hope that this isn't a new concept for you, but if it is, I want you to dig into it, because a lot of times deficit-based approaches are unintentional. They're well-meaning people, but we're falling a little bit short in thinking about how we shift the language that we're using to talk about first-generation students. What we heard in our data collection was that the challenges that first-generation students face were very often perceived as shortcomings in their character and not things that were happening in their lives that maybe they needed to overcome, or there were barriers. I fundamentally believe that more of the issues that first-generation students face are bureaucratic issues that our institutions place in front of them that we have to help them figure out how to navigate and jump, or we have to help them remove. And it has nothing to do with the shortcomings of their particular character. If you are not familiar, a few years ago, a book came out through AAC&U called Student Ready Colleges, and it talks about this shift to being student ready, and there's quite a bit of information in there around how to shift your language to being asset-based and shifting your work, and we're going to talk more about Student Ready Colleges here in just a moment. You'll see now, you're starting to see some institutions pop up. These are institutions who are doing particularly savvy work in this space. students. Northern Arizona has done great work in shifting to an asset-based academic advising approach, and thinking about the language that they're using and the approach that we're taking in doing the work. This is also where auditing is really useful, and auditing our policies and procedures to think about putting an asset-based lens on the work that's happening for first-gen students. So another quick highlight, and I mentioned just a few minutes ago, faculty development. I get 2 or 3 pretty regular questions in the center, and one is always, how do we do better faculty development around first gen? And there are really, to me, honestly, 2 prongs to this conversation. One prong is just general engagement, celebration, understanding their first gen identity. What does it mean to support first gen students? And the other side is, how do you teach first generation college students? What does it mean to create a first gen friendly classroom? And so Cal State Fullerton has a really fantastic workshop series that runs through their Faculty Development Center. North Central College, if you're not familiar with North Central, just outside of Chicago, man, what a fantastic first gen focused institution. And they have faculty engagement in so many ways at their institution. It's really just outstanding. So there's some highlights of faculty development in the report, as well as student organizations. So we are seeing a dramatic uptick in student organizations, first-gen student organizations across the country. And they really take on different types. Some are social in nature. They just want to get together and have a good time. And others are more activist. They are partnering with the institution. A great example of this is the First Gen Student Organization at Ohio State University has actually pushed the institution to creating a First Gen Student Center. And it's actually going to be opening within the next year. We're working with Ohio State on that build right now through our First Scholars Initiative. And it's really a student-led initiative that the institution has gotten behind. And so really seeing some interesting work there, and a lot of that is featured in the report too. So let's talk about institutional shifts. So we went out and we talked to a lot of institutions, and we continue to talk to institutions every day. And I've yet to find an institution who has said to us, you know, we're good. We have figured out the first gen thing and we're fine. And really what we heard was that they were all in this point of flux. They were all saying, you know, we're trying to move from here to there. We don't think we're doing enough. We think we need to shift differently. And so what we heard were 4 particular areas: college ready to student ready, reactive to proactive, cohort to cohort plus network, and then general high impact practices to tailored first gen practices. So let's dig into these a little bit. And I mentioned this earlier, we're going to come back to it here. College ready versus student ready. Again, if you haven't seen the book and I could try to drop it in the chat here for you when we get to the chat time, the Student Ready Colleges book, it's on Amazon. It's a great read. Michelle Asha Cooper, who's now in the Department of Education, was the lead author on that with Tia Brown McNair. And it really talks about how we have to change the way we do business in higher education to support first-gen students. And again, I'm not going to read these to you, but one of the best quotes in the entire report is right here in front of you. And it's the wonderful Dr. Kay Monk Morgan. Kay is now the Vice President for Strategic Enrollment at Wichita State, and the work that Wichita State does in the first gen space is second to none. It is outstanding work. We just met this week again, and I'm just always blown away by the great work that they're doing. But she talks about how we're sending students into environments that were not created for them, that we don't have to hold their hands, but that we have to walk beside them because their institutions are not nimble enough to give them what they need to be successful. So, I mean, you all know, if you've worked at an institution or you're in higher ed in some way, or you're in K-12 education, the bureaucracy is rampant. And the things that we do, the challenges, we put all kinds of confusing words in front of them. We had a student at Cornell, when we did some interviews there, tell us that he actually did not pay a bill because he spent an entire day trying to figure out what a bursar was. He just couldn't figure out he didn't realize that that's where he needed to go. We do things that make higher ed really, really challenging. And I think the COVID experience probably really exacerbated that for a lot of people. And so, digging in, thinking about that. You'll see a couple of examples over here. The University of Michigan has created a gateway experience, which is a centralized location where they have service providers who are first-gen trained from all of their student services office who do office hours there. So students can come and meet with an academic advisor, a career counselor, someone from financial aid in this particular space where they know these people are first-gen trained and first-gen ready to talk with them. So really interesting interesting work happening across the country in that space, but doing some student-ready work in your spaces is always encouraged too. So reactive versus proactive, nothing rocket science about this one. Working with first-gen students is a very reactive experience. We've very often heard in our data collection that, well, we didn't know they were first-gen until they were leaving. We didn't know they were having a problem. We found out they were first-gen on the exit interview or in the follow-up, because good data collection wasn't happening on the front end, and we weren't doing things like early alert or understanding what the first-gen identity meant specific to that student. So institutions talked with us a lot about being creating a shift to being more proactive. UT Dallas has created a really fantastic first-gen living learning experience that's been really useful in helping to identify students who were struggling earlier. So lots of good things happening in that particular space. Cohort and cohort plus network. You heard me use the word networked earlier, and it's a really important one. I want you all to hear something really clearly here. Cohort programs are fantastic. So most institutions, you're looking here at 73% of institutions. Community colleges, it was about 78%. Were using cohort-based experiences for first-gen students. It doesn't mean they were specific to first-gen. It might have been a first-gen plus low income plus Black men's program. We heard a lot about programs for Black males in this experience. They're fantastic, and we love them, and we know that they're successful. We also know that they cost a lot of money, and they take a lot of time and resources, and they often serve very small numbers of students. So how do we shift our work from thinking about cohorts to continuing to offer cohort experiences, but also networking resources across the community? So you have sort of a centralized place that coordinates first-gen and thinks about the needs and efforts. And then how do we make sure everyone across the campus community is familiar with those resources, that understands how to support those particular students? So that when a student is not getting what they need in the first-gen peer mentoring program, you know that there's a really great opportunity for them to join the first-gen chemistry living learning program, for instance. And how do we connect those resources? What we heard overwhelmingly, and we continue to hear in the center, is that the same small pools of first-gen students are getting a ton of services, and other students aren't getting anything. We actually had a student contact the center who said, I'm trying to figure out why I get all these emails from my institution about being first-gen and my roommate doesn't get any, and we're both first-gen. Can she go with me to things? Because I'd really like to take her along. I had a student at UT Arlington ask me if she could leave her place in TRIO Student Support Services so her roommate could take her place because they couldn't serve anyone else in the program. And so how do we network those services? So as we often talk about in the center, it's embed in the fabric of the institution that we're a first-gen friendly place, rather than saying, oh, well, certain students get certain things. You'll see some great institutions here at the bottom doing outstanding work. A lot of them have grown first-gen centers, just really outstanding work. A fantastic example of a networked approach is some of the work that's happened at Wake Forest, the growth of their Magnolia Scholars Program alongside their First in the Forest program. They've been able to really scale resources, and I can share more about that here in just a little bit. And then high impact practices versus tailored approaches. So I hope you're familiar with the work of George Koo and the 11 I think we're at 11 right now, high impact education practices that many institutions know to be successful, and because of that, they often gravitate toward those. They're also known to be culturally responsive practices. Generally speaking, it depends upon how they're implemented. So many institutions look to high impact practices as a way to often fill gaps or to save time. The two particular high impact practices we heard a lot about in our work were living learning communities. So I mentioned earlier UT Dallas. The University of Cincinnati has a fabulous, the Gen 1 Learning House. It's fantastic. And then also study abroad. I'm sending first-gen students on study abroad experiences, either embed in traditional programs or as a part of first-gen specific offerings. These are growing all across the country. There are a lot of these happening. I think I met last week with 4 different institutions who were all working in this particular space. What we heard that was particularly challenging was the lack of tailoring, and really in particular in the study abroad space. And what I mean by that is institutions saying, we're going to take students who are first gen on to this X location. Great. And we're going to schedule a first gen meet and greet. We're going to do an interest meeting. We're going to even bring their families in to teach them what it means to be first gen and study abroad. And we're going to get everyone on board. And that's awesome. And then when they actually go abroad, all that stops. There were no first gen faculty on the trip. The students were not identified as being first generation. There was no conversation about re-entry after the experience. And so we can't just say, hey, we're going to take the practice and put first gen on it. We have to think about tailoring those particular resources. This was a prevalent conversation at our community and technical colleges as well, in that how do you serve such large numbers of first generation students without saying, well, the financial aid office is good for everyone, so sure, it's fine for first generation students too. What we really heard there was flipping that narrative. How do we build programs and services that are good for first gen students, and then we know they do serve everyone? And that's a nuance, but it's important. If you think first gen first, it really does support everyone's needs at the institution. Here we go. So what we're going to talk a little bit more now is around learnings from the front lines. And what this is a set of challenges, and then also ways that institutions were responding to these particular challenges. And so the 4 challenges that we heard most often, and we were not surprised by any of these, were lack of alignment on what programs need to achieve, inconsistent, disjointed, reactive student support, lack of consistent student data and insight, and resource constraints. Resource constraints were really prevalent at our community and technical colleges, and that's not a surprise, I can imagine, to anyone here. Resource constraints, and again, trying to serve large numbers of first-gen students with very little supports. So we're going to talk a little bit about we're going to address, let me start that whole sentence again. The approaches being used to address them, and we'll offer some examples. After that, I have a few recommendations, and then we'll use our remaining time for any questions that you might have, but feel free to drop those in the chat whenever it is useful. So we heard a lot about appointing a single advocate, and I want to be really careful here. If you heard nothing else today, hear this. It is not the responsibility of one person to serve first-generation students at an institution. It is everyone's responsibility to have first-generation students on their mind. What this means is that there needs to be a person or persons who are made officially responsible for leading the charge for first-gen students. Really, I often call it keeping their eye on the first-gen ball, making sure that we don't lose sight of this particular work. Some folks call it the squeaky wheel. This is the person in the meeting who says, but what about first-gen students? Have we thought about the needs of first-gen students? How does this impact first-gen students? And that's what we need to hear. At the time of this data collection, about half of the institutions have identified a first-generation point person at 4-year institutions. It's only about 25% at community and technical colleges. We would imagine that this number is dramatically higher now. I would say in the last couple of years, we have seen a dramatic increase in what we call point people being identified at the institution. We're seeing a growth in first-gen coordinators, first-gen directors, first-gen centers. We have 215 institutions through the center who have received the first-gen forward designation, and they're really leading the charge in getting these people in place at institutions. And so you'll see this number is growing in particular. What was particularly interesting in this data collection was who holds this role. And at the majority of institutions, it was a master's level student affairs professional who had been in their role between 3 to 5 years. Excuse me. What we heard from institutions was that was great from a practical lens. Getting work out to students, working directly with students, building peer mentoring programs, fabulous. But the problem on the other side was that, and using their words, there was no one who had a seat at the table. There was no senior leader. There was no person who had administrative authority, who had a seat at the table, a voice in the conversation. So really what institutions are doing are creating partnerships. And in the center, we work with institutions to help you build a steering committee, who are folks who are senior leaders. And the work that we see moving the best, in Wichita State being a great example of it, are when we have senior leaders in partnership with our mid-level leaders and our practitioners, our entry-level folks, working together to build an experience that supports first-gen students. And so, again, if that's something you're interested in doing at your institution, we're happy to continue conversations with you about that. So tracking end-to-end student data for insights, and I'm gonna dig in here just a little bit because I want to keep us moving along. But data collection is really challenging when it comes to first-gen students, and if you don't do it on the front end of your experience, it's really hard to catch up. And this is also where knowing what your definition is really important, but also making sure that definition makes sense to your students. We've talked with so many institutions who have said, what's your question on your admissions application for first gen? You know, what's the highest level of baccalaureate degree received by your biological mother? What? Like for a traditionally aged college student or even a non-traditionally aged college student, that's a messy question to understand what baccalaureate, that might be the first time they've ever heard that question. So thinking about how you simplify your questions, and then how do you begin tracking data? What can we find out about their high school experience, their home, their parents, their support, anything that can help us support our students? And then where do they go? Where's the first destination after completion? What are their goals for transfer? What are their goals for long-term completion, career goals? All of that being really, really useful information. And I'll tell you, if there's something I can offer you, find yourself a friend in the IR office. Find out who your IR friend is who's first gen, and you might be able to pull on the heartstrings a little bit to offer some support, because your institutions are chock full of data. My good friend and colleague, Mary Fugate, who works in the center, always says that our institutions are like refrigerators, and they are full of data, but we're always going out for dinner. And so sometimes we have to kind of look within and see what kind of good data is available to us. And so I am going to point out some really interesting data that's on the screen for you here, and then I'm going to keep us moving. But about 80% of our institutions that participated in these studies identified first-generation students in the admissions process. So that was pretty great. Like we were like, okay, awesome. And then it dropped to 61% around tracking student data, success data for students. And I thought, well, that's not great. If we're collecting the information, then why are we not continuing to track it? And then we got down to 41% of those institutions using data to inform decisions. So we're collecting it, but then we're slowing down on tracking it, and then we're really slowing down on using it to make decisions. And then you'll see 28% identify first-generation students in the student information system. And that one really just kind of blew my mind. And I thought, why are we not using this information? So we went back out and we did a second data collection on this particular metric and tried to find out what was going on. And the answer to the question was really concerning for me. And I'll share with you the reason that institution leaders said that they did not include it on the student information system was out of fear of students getting profiled. And what I mean is a student goes into their advising appointment and it says in the student information system that they're first gen, and the advisor saying, oh, well, if you're first gen, then maybe you shouldn't take 15 hours. You should only take 12 hours or 9 hours. Oh, you want to be a STEM major. Maybe you shouldn't be a STEM major. Have you thought about doing something else? And so this goes back to that asset-based approach conversation. And it really broke my heart that we were making choices to disadvantage students to have that information and be a part of a conversation about academic planning in a proactive way than rather than getting our faculty and staff trained on how to be better advocates for our first-gen students. And so I always think that's an important conversation to point out as we're thinking about data. So again, a couple of highlights here, some work in the report around how we don't use our own faculty to research first gen and then learn about our own institutions. It's like sometimes I think we forget we have really smart people all around us who could be helping us think about this. And then also some really interesting work in the report around partnering first generation students with first gen alumni for internships, for job placement, for mentoring. So some interesting approaches happening there. So vision and objectives, a lot of confusion on vision and objectives when it comes to first-gen students. What are we trying to do with our programs and services? What does success even mean anymore? You'll see here across the data points that when we asked the reasons for supporting first-generation students, institutions said retention, degree completion, academic performance. That made sense. What was interesting was the conversation around, well, actually, sense of belonging is what many people believe was the most important. But if you can get sense of belonging, it allows you to get the retention, the degree attainment, and the academic performance much of the time. Not always, but a lot of the time. And so many of our institutions are actually placing sense of belonging first in the work that they're doing and trying to build belonging-centered cultures, because they know that that will translate into the academic outcomes and co-curricular outcomes that they're particularly looking for. We also heard a lot about resources. Tight timelines, limited support. We also heard a lot of people talk about losing sight. So, well, this program started 10 years ago and it was for low-income students. And then a couple years later, we added it as a provisional admit program. And then a couple years later, we added first-gen students. And now we're not actually sure who we're serving because we're just kind of confused. That was a pretty common theme across our institutions. So understanding the reach of existing resources, and this really comes back to auditing how first-gen students are being served. We heard many institutions share, that things were being duplicated. There were programs in every single college that were really the same. There was mentoring, there was a professional development series, but instead of combining those opportunities, they were just doing them in duplicate. And how do you think about reaching more students with those existing resources to be successful? A really great example I mentioned earlier is Wake Forest University, and how they did this really important work was they have a very small cohort-based program called the Magnolia Scholars. It's a full scholarship program. So the dollars are limited and a very small number of students can get the scholarship. They have hundreds of students who apply every year. And they finally said, we can't give them all the money, but we can give them all the resources. Why can we only offer our workshop series to the 12 students who get the scholarship when we have 150 students who want it? So they offered a new experience called First in the Forest, which is a fabulous name. They got so lucky with that. And they now offer the workshop series for anyone who's invested. It's an all 4-year experience, or 4, 5, 6 years. It's free to students. It has all kinds of interesting components. And anyone who's interested can come, but it's a requirement for the Magnolia Scholar students. And they just, as the director said, all I needed was a bigger room. It didn't cost me any more money. We were already going to do the work. And so thinking about how you're expanding the resources that you have available to you. Question I receive a lot is, how do we incentivize engagement? There's a lot in the reports on this as well, but 2 particular institutions that do unique things, UNC Chapel Hill and North Central College, do something that's not just traditional, here's pizza, here, things of that sort. North Central College actually offers, and it takes money to do this, each student who completes their workshop program receives a $500 book scholarship the next semester. So it's an incentive to return to college for the next semester, and you come back and you have this money already in your reserves to help you purchase your books. And so they've had a lot of great success with that approach. The other thing I'll tell you too, as a side note, get yourself a development officer. There are so many people out there right now wanting to fund first-gen efforts. Find somebody in your development community who's willing to talk first-gen with you and help you think about how you do things like pay for book scholarships. There are great alums out there who want to do those smaller dollar gifts, and they want to know that they're going back to something with significant impact. So that's always a great takeaway. So increasing ROI and funding, it was really challenging for institutions to overcome financial and human resource constraints. We are seeing more and more first-gen positions growing. We also saw a lot of them get cut during COVID, and so that's definitely a concern. The majority of our first-gen programs and services are through institutional funds, and that's where I tell you to go find yourself a development friend. You can look at examples. Kansas State University has a first-gen development officer. They do fantastic work in that space. Lots of good folks leading the efforts there. Northern Arizona also has a dedicated first-gen person that does their work. Some institutions like St. Mary's of Minnesota ran a capital campaign. They raised, the last time I looked, something like $18 million for first-gen efforts. It's amazing. But the dollars are out there in different places. Just last week, the University of Memphis received a $1.25 million gift from the Hardin Trust to support the development of their first-gen center. So there is good money out there, and that's something we're happy to chat more about too. But a lot in the report about these topics. And then finally, building an engaged community. And this is that conversation earlier about how it takes all of us to do this particular work. In particular, we see gaps in how faculty are being engaged. So you can see here about 65% self-identifying as first-gen. I think that number has probably grown a little bit since we released the report, but it still could grow. And then it starts to dwindle, speaking at events, serving as a mentor, serving on a task force. And find faculty who want to engage in this work in lots of different ways. Undergraduate research, asking faculty to hold a space on their undergraduate research teams for a first-gen student. What does that mean? There are a lot of really creative ways to think about faculty engagement. And we have found Celebration Day to be a real galvanizing force around getting faculty involved. But lots of good institutional examples across the screen here and also in the report. And then here at the end, there's another highlight in the report on communication. We get a lot of questions about, how exactly do you go about communicating with first-gen students? And so we ask some questions, and I'll give you the spoiler alert on this one. It's rare that you get 100% of anything on a survey, but here's what had happened in my life. We asked questions, and 100% of our respondents in our surveys said, yes, we use email as our primary form of communication. And 100% said it doesn't work. And I think we all know that. A couple of years ago, there was a University Innovation Alliance report that came out that says something like, we contact students over 400 times in the first 6 weeks of a traditional academic semester, and they don't read it. They don't know. There's also some social media information out there that says you have to get your message out in the first 6 words of an email, because that's all typically people read these days. So there's some interesting examples throughout the reports around newsletters, social media approaches, wild things like TikTok. How are institutions really engaging in different ways with students to get them connected to their communities? And so you'll find some more in the report around that too. So I'm going to wrap up my time with you. I don't know what that slide is trying to do, but I promise it says recommendations. And so I'm going to share with you a couple of recommendations for institutions and then a couple of recommendations for the higher ed community, and then we'll wrap up our time and happy to have a conversation with the time we have remaining. So you'll find these recommendations in greater detail in the reports, and so you can dig into these, but just as a reminder, consider how you can mobilize for institutional change and not just another program. So stopping the Band-Aid approach and thinking about shifting culture. Working on that asset-based approach, and you can do that in your own seat as well as a larger part of the conversation. Thinking about networking services within your community. Weighing that balance, broad reach versus meaningful sustained engagement. And it doesn't have to be either or. Some students need one or the other. And so thinking about how you do that in your communities. If you don't have a definition or you need to revise that definition, thinking about that and getting that figured out relatively soon. Comprehensive institutional assessments. We support this work through the center. We have a diagnostic tool in the center called an insights tool that's a part of our First Scholars initiative, where we collect information from across the campus community on how you're serving first-gen students, and it produces a 90-page report with 2,500 data points on first-gen efforts at an institution. And we help you work through that and priority set as a part of that. So if that's something piquing your interest, reach out, and happy to chat on that. Creating systems for your actionable data, building those communities of advocates, offering first-gen involvement opportunities with intentionality. We know many first-gen students are working, managing family priorities, and so, being a part of the sewing club feels challenging for them sometimes, but thinking about how do you tie involvement to your academic career, helping you make decisions, or they can be beneficial to the things that are happening in your life. And then considering post-completion engagement, the idea that somebody's an alum from day one. How do you start someone thinking about what does it mean to graduate from your institution or transfer from your institution to a four-year institution? And then quickly, recommendations for higher education, reinforcing that national narrative for student success, that it needs to be data-driven, seeking opportunities to promote the identity prior to matriculation. We know now that students are starting to learn about their first-gen identity as early as 5th grade. I didn't know till a few years ago, until I got into this work. I didn't know I was first-gen when I was in college. I didn't know that mattered, or it was a term. We're trying to do work around how do we recognize and reward institutions who are doing this space. That speaks to our First Gen Forward efforts. More on our website about that if you're interested. Building that culture of celebrating students, and Celebration Day is a great opportunity for that. I would encourage you to think about intersectional identities at your institution and how you really dig into your data in that space. We are doing some work to standardize some metrics around first-gen peer institutions, and if that's something you're interested in, we're happy to have conversations. West Virginia University is now a new First Scholars institution, and so really excited to see the good work that's going to be happening at WVU. And then sharing research and effective practice. Tell us what's going on in your spaces, and we'll try to also share with you all and create opportunities for you to do that. And so with that, I'll leave you with a final question. It's the question of the center, which is, how will you move first-gen forward? Every day in our work, we ask ourselves, how are we going to move the experiences of first-gen students forward? And we hope that each of you will do the same. And so great opportunity to chat with you all today. I wish we could be in person, but appreciate your time and interest. And again, happy to answer questions and happy to do any kind of follow-up after our time together today. And so thanks so much.
Dr. Whitley, one question that came in, I believe you just addressed, and that was specific to what institutions could do or next steps that they could take to become more student ready. And I believe you addressed a number of examples, and there are some great takeaways from this session, and we really appreciate your time and you lending your expertise today. Our next sessions begin at 4:30, and they'll open up here shortly at about 4:25. We want to thank everyone for joining us for this session this afternoon, and specifically to you, Dr. Whitley, for taking your time out of the day to share your insights and kind of outlooks in terms of what you're seeing on a national level and how we can apply it to the work that we're doing here in West Virginia. Sure. So we appreciate everyone. We will see you in the next session, and have a great rest of the conference. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.